Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jung Soo-shin, MC for today's lecture. I teach Korean classics at the AKS and in charge of managing international support for Korean studies. It is my genuine pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to the 75th Societas Koreana lecture meeting. So before lecture begin, I would like to briefly introduce Professor Lankov. Professor Lankov was born in Petersburg, at that time was called Leningrad. He completed undergraduate and graduate studies at the Leningrad State University. After graduation, he taught Korean history at the ANU, Australian National University. In 2004, he moved to Korea, and he has been teaching at the Kookmin University as a professor at the College of Social Studies. He is a quite prolific writer. He already published a few books. For example, The Real North Korea, Life and Politics in the Failed Stalinist Utopia, and North of the DMZ, Essays on Daily Life in the North Korea. Also, he published about 30 articles, and regularly he contributed to famous newspapers or magazines. For example, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. So I guess we are in for a real treat tonight. Please join me to welcome him.
So probably I should start. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. And well, let's start talk about North Korea. You know what I personally hate most? When people are talking about North Korea, this is the image you are going to encounter at every second publication. They will tell you that this is a crazy, mad Stalinist dictatorship run by a tyrant who is seriously overweight and have very bad haircut, who is irrational and unpredictable. Well, I would say it's completely wrong. North Korea is indeed a dictatorship in a very nasty place to live, even though it's significantly less nasty than it used to be the case a couple of decades ago. It's run by a young man, brutal, decisive, smart, Machiavellian, pragmatic. A very good choice of his dictator father, who was much weaker. A person who has good chances of keeping the power, not very good, but much better than his father once used to have, and who basically understands perfectly well what he is doing, and definitely master of survival against all odds, and if necessary, at any cost. Well, but first let's start about this image. This image has some foundation in history, because for roughly from the 60s, say roughly for 3 decades, from 1960 to 1990, 3 decades roughly, North Korea was the world's most perfect Stalinist society. Kim Il-sung, the founder, Kim I, was definitely more Stalinist than Joseph Stalin himself. He did a lot of things Joseph Stalin maybe secretly dreamt about, but did not dare to put in practice. For example, it was the most demonetized economy in the recent history. Money, and it was a part of deliberate policy, meant very little in North Korea of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Everything was rationed. Government decided how much you should eat. If you were doing heavy work, you were eligible to 900 grams of grain per day. If you were just an infant, less than 1 year old, you were eligible to 100 grams per day. Actually, it was your mother who received it. 9 groups of food kind of supply. It's an interesting topic. We have no time now. Everything was rationed from eggs to socks, which is often overlooked, however, is that rations were given essentially free of charge. Free. It was a bit like military life. In barracks, soldiers are not supposed to pay for their meals, but they are supposed to work hard. People were strictly controlled. Even domestic travel was largely banned. You needed to apply for a travel permit if you wanted to go to another province. Foreign travel was almost impossible. And it was the only country which criminalized ownership of tunable radio sets in peacetime. If you were found to be in possession of a radio set with tuning, which could be used to listen to foreign broadcast, you were a criminal, punishable with 3 to 5 years of imprisonment. Information isolation, control, order, no crime, no economic growth, great deal of stability. You know what? Many elder North Koreans feel now very nostalgic about this era, by the way. So, basically, yes, as a matter of would like also to mention that markets always existed, but they were marginal. And this system had a serious shortcoming. It was not sustainable in the long run. Things were made even worse by massive military expenditure. To keep abreast with South Korea, which began as agricultural backwater in the 60s, not in the 70s as some say, at least in the mid-60s, catched up with North Korea and then began to overtake. To keep abreast with much richer and South Korea with a larger population, they were spending more and more and greater share of their budget on the armed forces, on the weapons, and it was getting a larger burden. But basically, major problem is that this system is not remarkable, is not known for its efficiency. And it was kept afloat largely because of the Soviet aid. But the Soviet Union collapsed, and the aid was immediately discontinued. So, the end of the Soviet aid sent North Korean economy into a crisis. And it was a pretty tough crisis. We don't know how it culminated in the famine of 1996-1999, 4 years of famine. Nobody knows how many people died. North Koreans unofficially, quietly admitted 250,000 deaths. Repeated estimates of the NGOs which used to work in Korea talking about 2.5 or 3 million deaths. First figure is definitely underestimate. Second is definitely overestimate. Now, we have some reasonably reliable figures based on the published census, population census. So probably say between 600 and 900,000 people starved to death in those 4 years. And it was the worst humanitarian disaster in history of East Asia since Mao's Great Leap Forward more than half a century ago. Economy collapsed because they could not get subsidized stuff from the Soviet Union and other communist bloc countries. No spare parts. Actually, what actually happened, it was not a kind of political decision. But in the past, Soviet and East European enterprises were basically encouraged to sell stuff to North Korea for nothing. And now they began to demand normal international prices. They were not willing to wait until the victory over the American imperialism. Therefore, North Korea had no money to pay. Usual situation. And nobody was going to help it with money. So we had collapse of industry, collapse of fertilizer production, collapse of electricity production and collapse of agriculture. However, and to some extent, the country was kept afloat by the foreign aid. Interestingly enough, 4 major countries which provided significant amount of food aid to North Korea during the famine and immediately after the famine were China, South Korea, United States and Japan. As you see, 3 of the 4 countries were countries which technically were at war with North Korea. Don't tell me that you are irrational if you don't know how to make your enemies to feed you. And he succeeded. By the way, for your information, Russia did not provide any significant amount of food aid to North Korea, contrary to what I have often hear. There is some minor assistance recently, but it was roughly 60 times, I mean 60 times, less than the amount provided by China. So, but, you know, 500,000 people, maybe close to 1 million people died. North Korea has a population of 25 million. Others survived. How did they survive? Majority survived. How? They survived by rediscovering market economy. The food rationing system known as public distribution system collapsed. And it was a bit like for us, we suddenly discovered that all shops are closed. And nobody knows whether they are going to open. Imagine yourself in this situation. It was the end of the world, because rationing system was an operation, full operation, kind of all-embracing rationing system, since December 1957. You had 2 generations which you knew nothing but rationing. It was a massive shock. As I have said, markets existed, but to a very small extent. Very little monetary exchanges, which were discouraged. No private enterprise, even small private plots, which were common in other communist countries, which could be very large. I'm coming from Russia. We used to live in a village in Siberia, and my family come from that part of the country. And we basically, well, we had a cow, we had pigs, we had large kind of plot, about 3,000 square meters, if I remember correctly, my grandmother's story. But in North Korea, the maximum amount of plot, kitchen, garden was 100 square meters. Maximum. Which means enough to have a couple of trees and to maybe some kochu, some chili pepper, produce some chili pepper, nothing else. And everything collapsed. So people, basically, what did they do? Essentially, they rediscovered capitalism. They rediscovered capitalism from the scratch. And they were remarkably successful. In the early 2010s, it was estimated by Kim Yong-yeon from Seoul National University that 80% of the income of the average North Korean family now comes from private economy. There have been a number of attempts to estimate this size of the private economy in the share of private economy in the general GDP. Since in North Korea, all statistical data is either secret or top secret, we know nothing about exact data. And because it's collected in a very strange way, I would suspect that even Kim Jong-un himself has very imperfect understanding on what is actually happening in the economy, even though this young gentleman has a dream team of economy managers, of which more later. But so estimates are bound to be imprecise. But they vary they were made around 2010 by different research teams. They vary between 25 and 50% of private economies' share in the GDP, which I would say quite impressive. I strongly suspect that in some European countries you would have the same level. So, how did people survive? It was good if you were living in the countryside. When you go to North Korea, and I was in North Korea recently in May, 2 weeks, and we traveled a lot across the country. And you always see strange, irregular shaped fields on the mountains, everywhere. Once you get away from town from Pyongyang for more than 50 kilometers. You can even see such fields when you look through the Chinese border to North Korea. Irregular fields on very steep slopes. These are sothoji, small fields. This is what people did to grow their own food. On paper, all farmers were supposed to work at state-run collective farms for rations, which were either non-existent or very small. So they worked for a while, as little as possible, as easy as possible. Then they stole essentially as much fertilizer as they could. There are many tricks, like you're putting in your trousers a lot of fertilizer, yes, and then you have to basically tighten it down very tough. And, yeah. So you can get skin burned, by the way, but you want to be alive, and your family, we want them to be alive, so you do it. And then they went to these small fields, which could be sometimes 300, 400, 500 meters up. You climb there, usually using your old rusty bicycle as your only means of transportation, and you walk there. You produce food for yourself. You cannot usually plant rice, but you can produce corn, maize, corn. You can produce all kind of beans, and sometimes you produce stuff for resale, like tobacco. And you could sell it at the market. Second, you're also lucky if you're living near China or not far away from border. Smuggling with China began to develop. They were smuggling everything. I would say that archaeologists are likely to hate this era because there was a great deal of illegal digging. Pretty much all significant archaeological sites from the Korean era were discovered and essentially destroyed because local farmers were hunting for ceramics, Korean era celadon, to be resold to China, but Chinese are not particularly interested. They're not interested much in Korean ceramics. Koreans are, South Koreans and Japanese. It's by China, it moved to South Korea, so antique market in South Korea crashed around 2000 because of this flood of real and fake antiques, because they learned very soon how to make fake antiques from North Korea. They were selling herbs, they were selling all kind of metals, everything which was sellable. And they were getting inside food. On top of that, there was a massive labor migration because people moved to China to work. Chinese were paying exorbitant amount of money, $50 a month, plus room and board. A lot of people were going there to work do agricultural labor, work in timber industry, work as household aid, looking after sick people, a lot of kind of things. Many women essentially did what is known as marriage migration. Because girls are running away from impoverished Chinese villages near the border, and boys have to stay controlling their basically family fields, running the family fields. So, well, basically there was a great deal of de facto marriages. You cannot register because officially these women did not exist. They had no paper, they nothing. In a modern bureaucracy-driven state, if you don't have paper, you are a non-person. But some of them managed eventually to acquire Chinese fake citizenship. Most of people were basically going to China without any political motivation, just to come on the assumption that they would make money and then would move back to North Korea with a lot of money. And you know, if you spend a few years in China, you could bring back, say, $1,000. Of course, it was not as good as to go to as a slave labor to, say, Russia or Middle East. You know the stories about Chinese slave labor, North Korean slave labor. Terrible stories. Do you realize that these so-called slaves, every single one, paid a bribe which is roughly equal to annual incomes of the average Korean worker to become a slave, quote unquote. Without bribes, nobody to care about you. Do you understand that supposed slave, that is somebody who is lucky to be selected to work as a logger in Russia, as a builder in deserts of the Middle East, has to come from people with semi-privileged background. If you have a relative who was involved with any criminal activity, especially political activity, no chances. You are not allowed to become a slave unless you are paying exorbitant bribe. And finally, once you go once as a slave, what is your next dream? You save money to go as a slave again and again, as frequently as possible. Why? In Russia, you basically make $5,000 on the average. And your wife will buy a shop. And you will have a steady middle-class income. Going to China was not that good. But you still would come back with, say, $1,000 after 5 years of heavy work. Sometimes you would go to South Korea, but majority would come back to North Korea and you would start a business. Why? Because small businesses began to appear in the it's around 97, 98. Initially they were very small. A workshop, a food stall. People began to make stuff and sell it. They began to repair shoes. They began to imitate Chinese fashion because China stands for high quality and high fashion and high taste in North Korea, and to be imitated, admired, and also despised because they're sort of suspicious, not only at the government level and popular level too, envious too, frankly, because most North Koreans remember the days when China was so much poorer than North Korea. So you basically made this, and shops began to appear. State-run restaurants overwhelmingly closed their doors by, say, 99, 97, 98, and virtually in a couple of years, new restaurants began to pop up. They all were private. How can you run a restaurant? I will explain a bit later. And what is important for us? Yes, it's one of the such small shops, selling most likely counterfeit Chinese cigarettes. Just one story of a person whom I know quite well. Actually, she's somewhere nearby. They are having a dinner with one of my former postgraduates right now. Yes, and I have an appointment with this postgraduate after I finish. So they are somewhere, obviously, I believe, Indian food. So anyway, she used to be a school teacher in North Korea. Poorly paid. In the early 2000s, she married into a family of a mid-ranking manager from a local tobacco factory. And she began her own business. She was buying tobacco from the local farmers. She was either buying paper to make cigarettes from workers of this factory who were stealing it from the factory, or buying it in a large market nearby from Chinese merchants. And she had some connections with Chinese merchants who were bringing quality cigarette paper. She hired high school students, 5 girls, each one was paid 50 cents a day for roughly 6 to 8 hours work, which was seen as a good salary for a teenager in this small city, to use primitive equipment to make cigarettes. Then she bought from Chinese packaging, which imitated very well packaging of the Chinese cigarettes. So she was producing fake Chinese cigarettes. And her monthly income was about $800, roughly $800 per month. In the days when the average income of family in this region was probably $40 a month. So she was quite rich. Anyway, she just recently got a postgraduate degree from a major South Korean university, but as I used to say, it's another story. And there are not hundreds of thousands of women like her. By the way, women were very prominent and still are very prominent in the North Korean business. You know why? The entire state system was based on the assumption that every male should have a regular work. Females, once they married, could officially register themselves as housewives. So it was not illegal for them not to have a work. So if you're a male, it's a crime to be unemployed. Used to be. But if you're a female, it's okay. So females had much more time to be engaged in business. On top of that, by the way, around the same time, in the mid-1990s, the system of Palsamton, the 3rd of August payment, emerged. Which means, what does it mean? It means that people were allowed to pay for a right to be legally unemployed. It's not a bribe, it's an official payment. You make an agreement with your manager. It depends on basically many factors, no exact figure, but you make a promise to donate to budget of your factory, of your enterprise, a certain amount of money, which is usually a few times the size of your official salary. And you register as somebody who works at home, long story how it's done, I have no time for it, and then you basically do not attend your official job. You sometimes had to show up, have to still work in the system, have to show up for indoctrination sessions, for political events, but you don't go on daily basis. But you have to pay, and the pay, it's not cheap for a male. For a female, it's once you marry, and North Korean society is quite strict. It's supposed that every single adult has to be married. Singles are not supposed to exist. It's social. By the way, it has been traditional in most societies. The idea that somebody can be unmarried is quite new in most societies. So once you're married, you just do registration and can do it. So there was a great deal of people like them. But the old government, until Kim Jong-un, did not know exactly what to do about this situation. Kim Jong-un oscillated. Again, can talk about it a lot, have no time. Just to say briefly, oscillated between extremes. He went it. But there were periods when he was supporting this marketization, from 2000 to 2005. There were periods when he tried to eradicate it, from 2005 to 2009. Most of the time, including last 2 years of his life, he was sort of indifferent. He was afraid to admit it, being afraid of the political consequences, but he also was afraid to admit it, to accept it, to encourage it, but he also did not try to get rid of this market growth, market economy. But under Kim Jong-un, situation changed. I will start from one remark, from one statement. Kim Jong-un is probably most pro-market leader North Korea has had in the last 80 years. You can say 80 years, why? North Korean history is just 70 years, why 80? Because the last Japanese governor generals were not too pro-market as well. He grew up in Switzerland, which is important, and he belongs to the generation, actually the 3rd generation of North Korean elite. And North Korean elite think about an old feudal state, is overwhelmingly hereditary. If you are, say, a general, there are fairly high chances that your father, and maybe your grandfather too, but definitely your father, used to be a general. If you're a top bank manager, most likely your father was a top bank manager, and so on. So these people, this current generation, to whom Kim Jong-un believes, they do not really believe into the ideas of socialism anymore. They understand it's quite useful to maintain some ideological fiction to justify their state's right to exist and their right to run the country. But in the depths of their heart, they know that there is only one game in town now in the early 21st century, and the game is market economy. So Kim Jong-un began to, once he took power, he began to introduce a rather remarkable set of agricultural reforms, of economic reforms. Let's start from agriculture. As a matter of fact, by the way, before I start, all these reforms are very similar to what China did in the early 1980s. What is interesting, once he took power, in roughly a year, Chinese scholars discovered that North Korean visitors began to ask questions about Chinese reforms, and ask for books about China of the 1980s. One more year, and quite teams of exchange academics appeared in a couple of major Chinese universities. They did not attract much attention, but they were collecting everything they could find about Chinese economic policy of the 1980s. Of course, North Korea is not going to admit that it's learning from anybody, because one of the cornerstones of the official ideology is that Koreans are superior to everybody else, and they have never ever learned anything from anybody. But having said that, it's what they were doing. And we should not be surprised that Kim Jong-un's policy is very similar to what Chinese did. Look, first, he started from agriculture. Actually, you remember, he became the leader in December 2011. And in June, he introduced a new agricultural policy, June 2012, just 6 months later, which is basically household responsibility system. Farmers are allowed to register as farming family, is allowed to register itself as a work team. It's not family which is registering. You are not, technically you're not a family. Family agriculture is way too capitalist, God forbid. You are officially a work team, which just by coincidence is the same as your family. Or maybe you two families, sometimes it's neighbors, share. Your family is given a plot of land, not as property, God forbid, to capitalists. But you are explained that you will be working on the same plot for years to come. You harvest what you produce. It's up to you to decide what to produce. And you give a certain part of it to the government. Roughly 1/3, 30% in kind tax. Sometimes less, in some cases obviously a bit more, judging by the most recent data. But usually say everything, usually normally about 35%. Remaining 65% is for you to keep. The results? Well, have you heard much about famine in North Korea over the last 5 years? You hear a lot about floods and droughts and bad weather, but when harvest comes, you are not going to hear anything about famine. Why? Because one of my North Korean interlocutors said recently in May, in the past, our farmers were sometimes lazy. But under the new system, they are never lazy. Guess why? Because they are working for themselves. And food production is growing. North Korea is very close to food self-sufficiency. Second, industrial managers, they introduced a system which is called Sahyuji Kyo Quality, that which can be translated as system of independent management of a socialist enterprise. The word socialist can be safely crossed out. It's essentially, for those of you who remember how it used to be done in China, dual price system. So every SOE, state-owned enterprise, is supposed to produce a certain amount of stuff they produce, I don't know, washing machines, steel, whichever, to be shipped to the state at state prices, which are usually very, very low. Everything above it, which is usually about 2/3, but it depends, exact figures are not yet known, everything above can be sold at market prices to other enterprises or to individuals. And judging by what we know, they don't mind if a part of profit ends up in the pocket of the enterprise manager. And enterprises can fire and hire workers, which is new, and they can pay as much as they consider necessary. So if you are running enterprise which is doing well, and if you're a high-skilled worker, you can make up to $100 equivalent of $100 a month. It's an exorbitant amount of money by the North Korean standards of the last decades. Rationing system, however, keep in mind, is dead. Rations are issued only to small privileged groups, largely government officials military personnel and their family members. It's essentially a way of subsidizing politically useful groups whose loyalty is vital for stability. So rations don't exist anymore. So, finally, attitude to the markets. Well, North Korean new rich are quite happy because they have never had such a good life. Anti-market policy, which remain technically all this activity of the private enterprises, all this activity remains illegal. But these laws are not enforced anymore. Under Kim Jong-un, we have never seen a single campaign against private enterprise. Such campaigns were very common under his father. So, it's okay to become rich. And if you read the North Korean publications, not on Sinmun, not on Sinmun continues to peddle old line. If you do have some hints at these changes in Nodon Sinmun, but not much. But if you read their specialized publications, which are open access, it's not something top secret. But assumption is that very few people will be doing what, say, Peter Ward is doing, currently the Seoul National University. And what is he doing? He is reading Kyun Jae-kyung Gu 5 hours a day. A specialized economic journal. And what is emerging is a complete picture where they're essentially glorifying this new system, the market economy, however, without using the M word. They're always inventing some funny terms to describe, say, market prices are called contract prices, and so on. And it leads to a serious change. By the way, I would like to mention in passing that the old elite under Kim Il-sung, contrary to what you often hear, was not that rich. Kim Il-sung, North Korea was a country of great equality, maybe more egalitarian than Scandinavian countries. Because you remember, once I talked to a high-level family. I will not go into some details, but they were probably one of the top, maybe not 1,000, but maybe top 3,000 families in the country, maybe even 1,000 families, because they come from guerrilla-era aristocracy, participants of the guerrilla movement. What do they have? They had a nice 3-bedroom apartment, which was very privileged because they had 24 hours water supply, an elevator which was operating 24 hours a day. They had a maid who was actually from secret police, a lady from secret police, who was also looking after them in both senses of the word. And every second day, they were giving animal protein in shape of pork and in some exceptional cases beef. They had a car with a driver, but my favorite story, this high-level party official, his wife, who was a professor at the university, she's of kind of very tiny woman, and she could not handle the rush hour in Pyongyang. So, but she could not use her husband's car, so she had to take public transportation. So she had to wait at work until rush hour is over and came home very late. So they were not really rich. And now we see the emergence of the new rich. How is it possible? Largely because of a new institution which can be described as pseudo-state enterprises. What is a pseudo-state enterprise essentially? It's a private, if you run a small food stall, it's okay. You just go to a market, and markets have increased tremendously in size. You just have a stall, you sell, you do some cooking at home or on the spot, you sell it, everything is fine. But what if you want to have a restaurant? Can you have an illegal private restaurant? Yes and no. There is a very simple way to deal with this issue. You go to a city council, local city hall, People's Committee is called, and you make a suggestion. You say, it's usually a woman, I want to open a restaurant. And City Hall issues a decision which says that now, in its benevolence, local state administration is creating a new state-owned enterprise, which is on paper belongs to the state. This is a restaurant. and you are appointed the chief manager. Then you pay your money to buy all equipment. You find people who will be working, and you are running the shop, the business. Your condition: you pay money to the city council. And I would like to emphasize, you pay some bribes on top of that. But most of the payments are perfectly legal. Funny thing is, in all this interaction in the North Korean formal economy, you very seldom deals with shares or percentage. I mentioned the agriculture, but it's sort of exception. Because everything is in cash. You cannot control. If you are in the city hall, you have no idea how much this lady is making. And of course, she will do everything possible to underreport the earnings. So what is the solution? To have fixed rate. A local official who is slightly corrupt, but not too corrupt. Let's not overestimate. People are corrupt in North Korea, but not that much corrupt. He comes, he has a look, and he says, look, near the railway station, 50 seats, railway station nearby, good place, she's going to make $5,000 a month. Well, make you pay $2,000. Deal. And this money officially are delivered to the state budget. On paper, it's a profit earned by a state restaurant. If you make not 5,000 but 10,000, great. If you make 3,000, tough luck. If you make so little that you cannot pay, well, you will probably give it some leniency, but in a few months' time you are going to be kicked out. And somebody, a better businesswoman will replace you. But it's not, it's a kind of way you can deal with administration, and what is even more profitable is to deal with foreign trade companies. Because foreign trade companies, first, they deal with stuff which can be sold for hard currency, which is extremely profitable. And foreign trade companies have much more autonomy within North Korean system. So if you want to deal with something larger, you have to go to foreign trade company. What can you do? A lot of things. Say mining. A significant part. I know a person who used to run a gold mine in North Korea. It was a private gold mine. I have dealt with a couple of people who used to run coal mine. What did they do? They made a deal with an office of actually general political bureau of the Korean People's Army, that is chief indoctrination service. They made a deal because the chief indoctrination service has its own foreign trade companies. There are roughly 400 foreign trade companies. A lot of major North Korean agencies and big state enterprises have their own foreign trade company. They get license to trade. Like, General Intelligence Department, Reconnaissance Department of the Korean Army had a foreign trade company. And they are not selling shooting pans and poison. No. They're just selling seafood and coal. So you are general, you get the permission to trade in coal, everything. Well, VAC type of permission will tell you what you are supposed to trade in, but you can easily swap VAC with somebody else. You can buy and sell it. It's a bit like sellable documents, so you can find something to trade. You are a general. You spend all your life, if you are from, say, General Reconnaissance Bureau, spying on South Korean airfields. What do you know about mining for coal, selling coal in the Chinese market? Nothing. Do you have money? No. What would you do? You would like start looking for a smart investor. You will find somebody who has right experience and a lot of money. I'm talking, say, early 2000s, last days of Kim Jong-il, it was not that much. We are talking about basically something, 20,000, 50,000 US dollars. And this person, this particular person, who probably made money in small trade in the 1990s, most of them, or in some cases got money from their relatives overseas, usually in China, in exceptional cases from South Korea. I know one such case, of which if I have time I will tell a bit. This person gets money, Usually this person has money, he or she, very often she by the way, it's not political correctness, it's really many of them are women. In coal mining will be largely males, but not, in some areas it will be largely women. The person basically finds a good geologist, finds an old mine which was abandoned during the crisis, pump out water, pumps have to be are bought by this person, hire some miners, hire engineers, and start producing coal. High quality coal is sold overseas to China, low quality coal is sold on the local market. And basically your boss in the general reconnaissance department is still happily spying on the South Korean airfields, and you bring him one envelope with his personal bribe, and another larger envelope with money you are giving to the foreign trade company, so they can buy better camera, better optics to spy on South Korean fields, and to provide that they make sure their agents will eat meat every day. And part will go up to the Central Committee. And you will be also enjoying life and start thinking about buying a nice apartment in downtown Pyongyang. Economy is going to grow. It's one of many scenarios. These people, 4,000 mobile phones are now four million mobile phones. Well, maybe not that much for a country with 25 million people, but still impressive. So, yeah, Audi, you can see Lexus very often. Cars are much better in Pyongyang now. But these private, usually pseudo-state enterprises are especially common in seafood production, restaurant industry, road transportation, and retail trade. But once again, you have large manufacturing. I think I'm not in position to name some relatively large factories which are, to the best of my knowledge, actually privately owned. But I'm sure there are some factories with hundreds and hundreds of employees who are owned privately, according to this scheme. Talking about, I just give you some couple of examples about people whom I know. Actually, with her son I'm going to meet later this week, maybe on weekend. But her story is, she was born in North Korea near the border actually with China, and in 1985 she married to a recently retired sailor, Navy sailor, and moved to his place not far away from the border with South Korea on the Yellow Sea. It was 1985. And she soon discovered that this area had a lot of sea cucumbers, which are very favorable, very important part of the Chinese food, very, very expensive. So locals began around this time to harvest sea cucumbers. You need a diver, you need a small boat, and the diver goes down and actually manually collect sea cucumber on the floor. So people began to harvest sea cucumbers for resale to China. And she was quite an entrepreneurial woman. So what she did, it was one of the first, she actually is the earliest case of private enterprise we have discovered among the probably few dozen cases. She ordered her first steel, what is important, it was a steel hull boat. You cannot make it at home. She went to a local small shipyard and made a deal. According to her specifications and her husband's specifications, they made a good, sturdy, small boat, which was used as a base for diver. And they began to fish or dive, I'm not sure, for sea cucumber, and there were ups and downs. By 2005, she was running 3 boats, and was one of the richest family in the village. It was a small town actually. Her son said that we were probably the richest family in town, richer than the party secretary, richer than the chief of secret police. Yeah, it's a wooden hull. By the way, it's roughly about $1,000 would cost you to make such a boat. Another story about such a boat. I mentioned the slaves who worked in Russia. I know one family. They went to Russia. He came back. He bought 2 boats. He became rich. Because with money he made while logging trees in Siberian taiga, he could basically afford to do it. Or another story, I like the person, actually. He had a very long career and already was running a large enterprise when he decided that it's time to have a new investment. So, in the early 2000s, because the private trade was growing, one of the problems, one of the shortages was essentially shortage of transportation. So he decided to establish a bus company. Oh, sorry. He bought 2 old Japanese buses from China, smaller and larger, and began to run the buses between 2 North Korean cities. What's interesting, a bus had a crew of 3, which is standard for North Korea, by the way. You have a driver, you have assistant driver who acts as a mechanic, because it's very old, usually very old equipment. And you have a conductor. So what is interesting, drivers were expected to pay for being employed. Why? Because it's the same scheme. He had a deal with bosses. Every year, he was paying $20,000 to a foreign trade company under whose name the buses were registered. Have you had a look at the official paper of the North Korean government? There would be no references to this smart man. Officially, it would be that this foreign trade company, to make money, established a bus company. And this bus company was producing surprisingly stable income of $20,000 a year. He was actually making about $40,000. Question is, why such a scheme with crew? Problem is, he expected fixed payments from the crew because he had no idea he had no way to learn how much his crew was making. So he made a rough estimate of how much his 3-person driver, assistant driver, and conductor are likely to make, and asked for fixed payment. And then he pocketed a significant part of this amount, roughly half, and another half he was sending up. It's a very common scheme, by the way, in North Korea, because you have everything is out of books. And this is how such things are operating. Yeah, a bus. It's basically maybe one of his, no, it's too small. He had 35-seater and 45-seater. Another one, Mr. Cement, let's say. It's interesting in one regard. He got in serious trouble. He was arrested for an illegal trip to China. He went there. He was a mid-ranking manager. He went to China to meet his close relatives, who was living in, my understanding, still living in South Korea, but still alive, and was arrested by the Chinese as a legal alien, extradited to North Korea, spent some time in prison. Then he was released. And what is interesting, he went to a local Air Force academy and suggested a deal. Because his family in Seoul, via China, wired him money, $5,000, and we are talking about 2,000, that was a reasonably good amount of money. And the Air Force Academy did not bother that this person was just a recently released political criminal, because he had money. And he knew something, and he had connections due to his earlier biography in the cement industry. So he bought trucks, and he basically began from London a bit more, trade in cement, and also sold all this kind of, I'm not sure how to say in English, this kind of like sand-like stuff, largely cement. So how things are done. The results, I would say results are quite impressive. When people are going to tell you that North Korea is a starving country, now, as I explained, North Korean farmers are farming for themselves. Don't worry, they are doing quite well. And economy under Kim Jong-un began to grow very fast. Say, in 2017, it's a typo, 2016 growth, it's estimate of 2017. The growth was estimated by the Bank of Korea at 3.9% of that year. But Bank of Korea is notorious for underestimation of the North Korean economy. Most analysts believe that the actual figure is higher. So estimates might be as close high as 7%. It's one of the estimates of the Hyundai Research Institute. But let's say 5-6%. I usually say 4-5% on the assumption that nobody, including Kim Jong-un himself, knows exact figure. So we have a great deal of growth. And you are usually, if you come to Pyongyang, you know, I was absolutely surprised. I did expect it, but I hadn't been there for quite a long time. I was surprised to come to a North Korean supermarket. It's absolutely stuffed with goods. If you go for places, for foreigners, they have some restrictions. So they have not a good choice. If you go to a normal supermarket for locals, obviously rich locals, it's stuffed with all high quality merchandise. Most of this food, stuff, and many consumption items are made locally. Then you have construction boom and so on, construction boom a bit later. Then, one question. Very often you are going to hear that this is only in Pyongyang. No, it's not limited to Pyongyang. I've been in traveled a lot recently. Well, the countryside is lagging behind Pyongyang seriously. But, as one American president used to say, the tide rises all boats. Life even in the countryside is getting significantly better. People are better fed, better dressed. And in some cities, there is a massive construction boom in Pyongyang. Massive construction boom in Pyongyang. My impression is that roughly 1/3 of the entire city has been built in in last 5-6 years. Massive. A bit like China. Outside Pyongyang, much less, but you still have new construction. You have a lot more cars. You have much better dressed people. You have the shops full of merchandise. And, then, you know, one of these, I forgot to mention how rich people are called in North Korea. And they are called Dongju, masters of money. I would prefer to translate it as lords of money. And she is one of these, not lords, but ladies of money. Again, many of them are women because it was much easier for a woman to make starting capital, initial investment capital back in the 1990s. We have construction boom. The maximum cost of which I've heard is 150,000. It's North Korean analog to the penthouse on Manhattan. Normal price will be really good place would cost 80,000, and so flat would cost probably about 30-40,000 in Pyongyang. Much cheaper in the countryside. Sinŭiju, which is probably the second most successful city because it profits greatly from trade with China, both legal, semi-legal, illegal. They probably have roughly 50%, their real estate market is probably 50%. By the way, you can ask me, how can you buy a house? Is it legal? No, of course it's not legal. Everybody is buying and selling anyway. On paper, you are just swapping residence permits, ipsa diem. In practice, it's seen as completely equal to property rights. And you should not be surprised. I was growing in the Soviet Union, where the same situation existed from the 60s and 70s. Not so much selling, but it was quite common to swap houses, and if the quality was seriously different, you would pay extra, or you would get some money. Actually, it was not property, but nobody bought it. So people don't really care. And what is interesting, if you look at what Kim Jong-un says, he encourages private investment in construction. What is also interesting, if you read the new law of the industrial enterprise, it says explicitly that North Korean state enterprises are allowed and encouraged to attract, as they say, unused excessive money finances of the general population, which means essentially a loophole created to use private enterprises to legalize activities we have just discussed. This picture, I made it just 3 months ago, exactly 3 months ago, I think, yeah, 3 months, on a street in Pyongyang. You see, this is in construction. They expect it to become the most expensive real estate in the town. It's a high-rise building located next to Kim Il-sung Square in the very downtown of Pyongyang. Price is $100,000 and up. And you see this man, who does look very impressive, but you never know who is looking at what floor plan of the building. Yeah, maybe he's going to buy, or maybe he's just interested. I don't know. I could not ask. So, actually we have growth in real estate. We have also massive demand in service. We have boom in private education. North Koreans are Koreans, so they're crazy about educating their children. They stop at nothing when they are stuffing their children with knowledge. And because there is a great deal of corruption, I recently asked a North Korean merchant in a third country, I said, you are rich, you can basically bribe your children's way to Kim Il-sung University. He said, not exactly. Yes, bribes will have to be paid, but if they are very bad, they will not take them anyway. So it's a strange combination of bribe, political influence, and genuine knowledge. So we have private education, you will be surprised. A good teacher of math, English, and music is making very good money now in North Korea. Professionals are making good money. If you are, say, a good engineer working for a private company, $500, $400, $500. A good IT software specialist, we discussed some plans related to software, and I said, but in your country, software specialists are making $100, maybe $200. People began to laugh at me. Oh, yeah, they said, Professor, you have outdated knowledge. Not less than $300 now. Again, average salary of the average skilled worker is about $30, $40. Maximum for a manual worker is about $100. Average would say 30, 40. And if you are a skilled specialist, it's a gross equality, an equality in income, by the way. Still well below business people, but well, if you're a good teacher of piano, maybe $300, $200. Catering service. Servants are increasingly coming. And a lot of new restaurants, which are exclusively privately owned. So, what's happening now? What final questions? I have just 5 minutes, just to do a bit of speculations and one important warning. About speculations, what lays ahead? First, we have serious shortage of foreign investment, partially due to sanctions, but largely because North Koreans have been remarkably bad in treating foreign investments. To be honest, North Koreans have been remarkably prone to cheating on foreign investment. Or as people usually say, confiscation risks are excessively high, which is true. And we will not talk about Orascom affair or Xinjiang affair, we have had many cases. So there are some problems about investment. There are some discussions on whether North Korea can maintain an economic growth, even if sanctions are partially removed, which is a big if, without serious foreign investment, which is probably not forthcoming. Big question. Majority view believe that North Korean economic growth is not sustainable in the long run without investment, because investment was so vital in bringing about economic miracles in East Asia. But I'm not so sure. For record, I'm in the minority view, and I believe that a reasonable economic growth, not record-breaking, not anything like China, can be sustained even without foreign investment. Because they are working hard, and the market is not very large, but not tiny, 25 million people. But finally, when we are talking about North Korean economic policy, we have to remember that there is one major difference with China. In China, economic growth and growth of markets was accompanied by the political liberalization. In North Korea, we don't see it. In North Korea, actually, Kim Jong-un's policy can be described as policy of reforms without openness. Reforms without openness. When we speak about China, we always mean openness and reform. In North Korea, we are talking about reforms without openness. So, because of massive, in China, reforms and openness were possible, essentially because there is no South China. The existence of South Korea is hugely destabilizing. Think about East and West Germany. So, Kim Jong-un's policy is to change economy, to allow much more freedom for market economic activity, to gradually switch to de facto capitalist economy. It's what he wants and what he is doing, what he is succeeding remarkably. But he understands that if he relaxes the control over population just a bit, he will face a possibility of East German scenario, but on much more violent way. Because South Korea is so rich, because it speaks same language, it's so attractive. So he wants, his economic reforms are accompanied by measures to increase country's isolation. One of the first things Kim Jong-un did once he took power was to dramatically strengthen the border control. Borders with China used to be almost completely uncontrolled and unguarded. It's not the case anymore. He is staging campaigns against foreign videos and so on. But what is interesting, at the same time, instead of cracking down on computer use, he just chose a better way. North Korean authorities demand every North Korean computer user to install their own unique operational system, which is spying on you, making random shots of your screen few times a day, does not allow you to open any media file which doesn't have government signature, keeps your history, and so on. But it's legal to have computer. So even surveillance is going electronic. So he is not going to relax political control because he is not suicidal. He is not going to surrender nukes because he is not suicidal. But he is going to change country because he is not suicidal. Because he is smart, even though I will strongly suspect him to have a better diet. Thank you very much.